A couple of years ago, I was working with a graduate student who is tremendously talented, but wildly unfocused. They would come into their voice lessons like a bull into a china shop. We made some decent progress during their degree, but I couldn't help but feeling I was missing a piece of the puzzle. They tended to sing with too much effort, and oftentimes I felt as if I was only treating the symptoms of an unsustainable approach rather than getting to the real root of the technical issue. And if I'm being completely honest with you, on top of that, I felt thrown off kilter by this student, unmoored even. Look, they were a lovely human being, kind, funny, thoughtful. It wasn't that. It was just, I don't know why I felt shaken after their lessons sometimes. That is, until I met today's guest. Hi, my name is David Sisco. My pronouns are he, him, and welcome to my new-ish podcast, Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. This podcast is dedicated to the art and practice of teaching singers. It is an extension of my forthcoming book of the same title, which will be released by Routledge Press in summer 2025. Today, we're going to talk about Dr. Dan Siegel's theory of the window of tolerance in relationship to Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory. Our special guest today is Marcia Lesser, a dear friend and colleague of mine who is a somatic experiencing practitioner and somatic therapist. I will share more of her bio with you in just a moment. But first, let's talk about these theories and how they impact student learning. Developed by Dr. Dan Siegel, the window of tolerance is an optimal zone of arousal for a person to function in everyday life. When operating within the window of tolerance, we are in a place of social engagement, meaning we're in a state of being where we're able to safely communicate and learn. This is because within the porous boundaries of our window of tolerance, we can process signals or tolerate them without becoming overwhelmed and pulled into a reactive or a withdrawn state. When we become dysregulated, however, we move into either hyperarousal or hypoarousal. People in a state of hyperarousal are mobilized, vigilant, and may experience an increased heart rate, difficulty settling, sweating, emotional volatility, rumination, and excessive effort. Their jaws are often locked, their legs either twitchy or locked in place, their spine rigid, their eyes may be narrow, focused, and hard. Hypoarousal brings us toward withdrawal, immobilization, and perhaps even emotional and physical shutdown. Those in hypoarousal may experience the opposite responses: flaccid muscle tone, vague or foggy gaze, inability to think, slowed responses due to feeling outside the body, a lack of emotion, flat affect, and a varying degree of disassociation. As my colleague Marcia explains, Dr. Stephen Porges developed polyvagal theory enhancing our understanding of the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. Previously, the ANS was understood to be a two-branch system: sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic, or the on branch, readies us for activity, emotional expression, play, and, when necessary, the survival response of fight or flight, also called hyperarousal. The parasympathetic, the off branch, prepares us for relaxation, rest, socializing, and, when necessary, the freeze response, also called hypoarousal. Porges's model expands upon this theory to include two sub-branches within the parasympathetic branch, ventral and dorsal vagal. In the ventral branch, the cranial nerve controls facial expression, the middle ear, neck, and the voice, as well as cardiac and pulmonary systems. When met with a threat, our nervous system brings us to a place where we try to mediate by using social engagement. This is known as ventral vagal. We might ask for help, joke, or reason. And if this doesn't work, we mobilize an active threat response, sympathetic. If this is not successful, we move into freeze, dorsal vagal. And it's important to note that all of this is coordinated by the ANS, often outside of our awareness. How does this relate to student learning? Well, in his book, Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness, David Trelevin explains, the window of tolerance is tied to cognitive processing. With hyperarousal, our cognitive processing tends to be disorganized and in disarray. There's too much stimulation and oftentimes it becomes difficult to pay attention. With hypoarousal, our cognitive processing becomes disabled. It's hard to think clearly, and people often report feeling spacey, removed, and unable to concentrate. So that student I mentioned to you earlier at the beginning of the podcast, they were often stuck in hyperarousal. And what I now understand is that because I also tend toward hyperarousal in my own personal life, this particular student could tip me over into a dysregulated state if I wasn't careful. As I mentioned earlier, I learned about the window of tolerance and polyvagal theory through my dear friend and colleague, Marcia Lesser. Marcia is a somatic experiencing practitioner, a movement therapist, somatic psychotherapist, teacher, and writer. She's had a private practice on the Upper West Side of Manhattan for 30 years. A former dancer, Marcia works as a primary somatic psychotherapist, as well as an adjunct movement therapist. She works with me at NYU. Psychologists and medical doctors refer patients who are struggling with the effects of physical or emotional trauma, as well as those experiencing chronic pain and disconnection from their feelings and bodies. She combines her rich dance and movement background with a depth of psychodynamic techniques and the latest neurobiological approaches to openness, mindfulness, and change. Her approach guides clients to embodied self-awareness, a knowing from within that connects us to our personal or physical sensations and emotions. On a personal note, I reached out to Marcia because one of my students was working with her, and I could see how incredibly fast the singer was progressing. I knew I had something to learn from her, and boy, was I right. And what was so beautiful was that Marcia was equally open to learning more about the voice and how I work. This past academic year, Marcia and I started conducting research together, which we will share with you in just a moment. But first, please welcome Marcia to Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. Marcia, welcome to the podcast.
David, I'm very happy to be here.
It's always a good time to be with you, so thank you for your time.
Indeed.
So I've already given our listeners just a brief primer on the window of tolerance and polyvagal theory. And I was wondering if maybe you could share a little bit about your journey in becoming a somatic experiencing practitioner and what led you to the work of Siegel and Porgress.
Sure. I've spent my entire career finding ways to put the body and mind together. And I had a number of various school experiences and training experiences. But there was something missing. I had no idea what it was, but it just wasn't quite it. And then I had been hearing about somatic experiencing for a while from a number of colleagues. And there it was. It was the autonomic nervous system. It was the foundation, using that as a foundation to actually understand what happens in the body and mind when they're both connected and disconnected. And with that, I was able to put my work into much more of an understandable perspective for myself and then for students and clients. And it was really exciting and challenging. And we did, in this 3-year training program for somatic experiencing, we did study a number of different models, polyvagal being one of them. Not in great depth, but definitely being one of them. So when I finished with somatic experiencing, I just had a thirst to find more and more. I still do have that thirst. And so found out a lot more about the polyvagal theory, which this was about 15 years ago, I think, something like that. And the polyvagal theory was, I think, just becoming very, very much accepted by people. And Siegel was one of the people that I picked up to understand actually first more about the brain and how it affects the body and vice versa. And especially his theory of the window tolerance, to me, again, is sort of ties body and mind and voice and spirit and everything together. So that's how it happened. And it's still happening because there's research, neurobiologic research happening all the time on the brain and the body and new theories and all. So it's exciting.
It's so exciting, and it's such a reminder that, like, I mean, we know all of these things are connected, but to have this information and to be able to activate it in the studio, I think is incredibly powerful. As I've been saying, it doesn't necessarily change the way that I work with students, but it offers a very powerful framework, not only for me to be able to see when somebody goes into dysregulation, but then also I think giving students the agency to kind of know where they are in their, in or outside their window, right?
Oh,
Is that agency is
absolutely.
huge.
Absolutely. Both in their singing and acting life and in their personal life, because of course they mirror each other. So it's huge. And I know after years of studying a number of different psychological theories, et cetera, um, when I discovered the autonomic nervous system and the real body brain connection in the brain, in the real brain body connection, it was such a relief because it takes off the onus. Like, why am I doing that to myself? What is that? How can I change that? When we understand, actually, it kind of gives me goose pimples as I say it. When we understand that it's all about the nervous system protecting us, sending us to places where we're safe enough. And then that can be changed by literally rewiring the nervous system. So we find new ways to find safety, more towards people as opposed to away from them. And it's just, I've seen this with so many students and clients that there's this sigh of, oh, so that's what's happening. So it's quite something.
One of the things I talk about in my studio is that, singing often trips the wire of the autonomic nervous system.
That's a good way to put it. I like that.
Yeah, it's like, wait, this is feeling vulnerable. This is feeling maybe dangerous. We don't quite know. So we got to shut this down, right? Because
Absolutely.
we don't know what's going to happen. And so, you know, through you and kind of researching this, realizing that, the vagus nerve is connected directly to the diaphragm. So, of course, anything that the amygdala is like, "Ah!" like kind of freaks out about, it's going to lock the diaphragm, right? Which, of course, is devastating for the work we want to do as singers, right? So it's again, it's realizing that all of these things are connected and that there's a reason that there's logic behind why these things happen and that we can
Yes.
impact that.
Yes. And once we learn when we're in these threat responses, once we learn that there's logic behind it all, that also calms the whole. Oh, so that's what it is. Uh-huh. And that it helps us to find agency again, because when we're in these threat responses, we lose that. And that is quite a thing to find agency, to be able to choose where we want to go and what we want to do.
Absolutely. So, as I shared with our listeners, I first reached out to you because I saw the work you were doing with my students and how quickly they were growing as a result. And I was like, I have got to meet this person. There's something that's going on that I need to know more. And that led us to kind of co-teaching and doing some research together. And so I thought maybe we could kind of get into that next, talking a little bit about um, the goal of our research and what we learned over the course of, I think it was like 18 to 20 hours of co-teaching that we did. We were looking at what are the somatic and vocal cues of dysregulation in singers. When do singers go into hyperarousal? What does that look like and sound like? And then where do they go into hypoarousal? Again, what does that look like and sound like? And then what are the things that bring them back into their window of tolerance, right? Back into that place of social engagement, which we know will allow them to kind of do their best work, right? Um, obviously I had to be a quick study because you knew a lot of this, but I know that you learned also a lot about the voice, and you were hearing changes in the voice. But the thing that I really loved about our work together that we continue to do that we is that we get to kind of explain to each other what we see and hear happening, right? Can you talk a little bit about some of the somatic cues that you see in singers when they go into dysregulation, either in hyper or hypo? What does that look like? What are the things that you're kind of scanning for when someone comes in?
Yes, well, when someone comes in, actually, always, I have them find regulation before they get up to sing, coach. So that is most important. And, but, and there are many ways to do this and to help ourselves and others regulate or arrive in social engagement. Okay, so what I look for is people's faces, first of all, starting from the top and going down. When someone is in a sympathetic activation or hyperarousal, often when they're really in it, because certainly we want some of that, we want activation. But when they pass out of their window of tolerance and they go into high activation, their eyes are often really narrow focused, like this, like, I see you. I don't care about what's here because I have to keep my eyes on you. So this
Mm,
vigilance. And I don't know if you can see it, but I'm doing it with my eyes. I
yes.
also feel my face just kind of flattening out. And also, of course, I feel just by doing that, David, I feel anxiety in here. I feel because where I go when I'm in a threat response is sympathetic activation. It's like, so I can feel like I want to do this. But so I look at their faces and their eyes, and there are a number of things to do to help people to expand in their face. It's important to know that the eyes and the face and the heart, when we're in social engagement, there's a real neural connection between the two. That's
Mm,
what, okay. And also, so either their face and eyes in activation, or just really flat and their eyes just kind of like this, not taking in that much. And this, instead of sympathetic activation, it's like going towards the spine, might be curving in this way, going towards collapse, not necessarily that they're in it, but there's this. And when there's this, the arms are often dead. They kind of have to be dead at the side, like not connected, not attached. So
yeah.
um, I look at a person's legs, and although it's harder when someone's sitting to do this, what if I can't see it in their legs? What I do is I actually ask them if they're feeling their feet, if they're feeling their calves, if they're feeling their legs. Oftentimes, they are not. So first thing that happens when we're in a threat response is that the flow from the feet to the top of the head and back down is disturbed. There are 6 or 7 flows that get disturbed within the body. And all of the energy starts to leave the feet and legs, leave all of this, and go up to the head. And that's the looping. And that's the this. And so if they're up here, helping them to find whether they're in hyper or hypoarousal, helping them to find their feet and their legs and moving the energy down, then helps them to settle the rest of the body, because what happens in one part of the body always affects every other part of the body, of course, including the larynx. And so that can settle. So finding a person's legs and foundation is most important, no matter where they are on this scale.
I have been so struck in coaching with you, how good you are at seeing these things. Because you're like, I, certainly as voice teachers, we're aware of posture, right? That's really important. But what you're talking about, I think too, is it's an energy flow or a lack of energy flow, right?
So
And
absolutely.
and being aware of when that is not flowing. And one of the cool things is because of our work together, I'm starting to see in my own students when the energy is there and not there. And so yeah, having those kind of touchstones, those things that we talked about earlier in the podcast, that narrow focus for hyper and kind of kind of flaccid muscle tone for hypo, those benchmarks can be really, really helpful to kind of knowing that a student may be heading toward one of those dysregulated states, right?
Yes, yes. And I have to say that what's been really exciting and so informative for me, that although I've worked with a number of different voice teachers here at NYU, there's and we coach together, but there's never been a time like this where we slow it down and me and you are in the same room together, and I feel and see energy, and you hear things in the voice like, what are you here? It's the same kind of thing. It's
That's,
what we know. And it's been really very exciting for me to begin, definitely the beginning, but to hear a little bit of what you hear.
yeah, and maybe that's a great segue to, when we perceive somebody's heading toward hyperarousal, one of the things that I'm noticing is that usually that the diaphragm becomes locked, or that there's this kind of like increased or very fast contraction of the diaphragm. There tends to be increased breath pressure, and as a result, the singing becomes more effortful, and registration shifts can become harder. There tends to be a lot of jaw and tongue tension. The sound can be manipulated or manufactured. And it's more kind of what I would call vertical singing, kind of note to note rather than kind of connection,
Rather
right?
than flow.
Yeah,
It's the same. It's the same thing that I just said.
exactly right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then, with hypo, uh, um, heading toward hypoarousal, we're talking about a lack of breath engagement. Um, right. Either because as you said, those who tend toward hypoarousal, sometimes they're gonna collapse their chest, which means, they're a lot of times we've seen
Yes.
that means that the chin comes forward, and so there's the alignment is not where it needs to be, right? That also means that collapse does not allow them to properly inhale, right? Because they can't access their pelvic bowl, they can't access their the release of the diaphragm in the way they need to, right? And so that inability to inhale obviously impacts the tone, which makes for challenging registration shifts in different ways, and that there's often less, what I would call less sustainable resonance pattern. Singers tend to not be in their resonance. So
Yes.
it tends to be kind of a sound that sounds a little kind of back, and is also vertical because it lacks that kind of consistent forward energy.
And to translate what you just said,
Yeah.
um, into what I see is that when a singer is in one of these states, the resonance from my world is not the resonance that you're talking about, but it is the resonance between me and you, for instance, or the student, voice teacher, performer, audience, whatever. There should be this happening. It's called an empathetic mirror neurons, empathetic, right brain to right brain flow between the two.
Mhm.
And that flow is not there. And I understand this vertical thing because it's like this instead of like this. And
Rather
so
than that
it
circle,
is,
yeah.
again, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
And what I'm talking about, in order to find that, and of course what you're talking about, in order to really connect this way with another person, there has to be within ourselves a body-mind connection. Has to be. Oh, it is impossible otherwise, which makes me think a lot of the polyvagal theory.
Yeah.
And David, I want to say one thing I really learned from our coaching together, or that was really, really interesting to me, especially, is you and I were always and are always in sync. Like it flows, there's a flow. It's like,
Yeah.
like we get it on whatever level we're getting. And so it flows from you to me. And then there was one time where we were working with someone and we had done exercises at the beginning to have him regulate, and he did. Then as he was singing, he became more and more connected to himself. And this sent his nervous system in, I think, literally into terror.
Yeah.
That's an important, really important thing. And then I think before I even noticed that was happening, what I noticed, either in the moment or later when I thought about it, I don't know, that you and I, for the first time, were not in sync. Like our work was not flowing. Like you were saying one thing, and I think we actually were talking about the pelvic bowl, perhaps, which to me, that's the foundation. But it wasn't like this was not happening anymore. It was like you, me, that. And that was something. And I want to say that this is really important. And he's an extreme case. But often when people become more engaged with themselves, more present, there's a part of them that, of course, is saying, oh, this is good. It's good for my singing, my acting. And then there's the underbelly of that, which is, oh my God, what is happening here?
Yeah.
Because they come out of their protective states and they don't know yet what to do and whether it's safe. And that's really an important thing for everyone to understand.
Again, there's so much that's going on underneath the surface
So much
that I think we have to become aware of as teachers to the extent that we are able, right? And I certainly feel like polyvagal theory and window of tolerance is a way to access some of that.
Yes, without a doubt. And this seems like maybe a good time to talk a little bit about neuroception.
Please.
Neuroception was coined by Dr. Porges, and it is that, this is beneath consciousness, but our nervous system is always, like in this moment it's doing it, is always scanning for danger or not danger, safe or not safe, constantly. And as I said, it's below consciousness and it scans for danger within us. So scanning our heart, our intestines, lungs, etc., between two people and in the world at large where we are.
Mm-hmm.
And so if, for instance, when a student comes in for a lesson, if their nervous system picks up safety or enough safety, like it's really safe enough from their teacher, and again, they are not, for the most part, they're not thinking about this, but if their nervous system feels, okay, this is okay enough, then they stay in a regulated, social engaged place, with a flow. Sometimes they'll feel activated if something's hard, but they'll come down. There's resilience. If their nervous system picks up that this is not safe, then they are immediately going to go into hyperarousal, the vigilant, muscles locked, I'm ready, or they're going to go towards hypo, which is also hypo, which is also going towards dissociation, shut down, and freeze. That just automatically happens. So it's most important to understand that the way we are affects everybody, but affects the student sitting across from us tremendously.
Yeah. And so, we've talked about, I know we've read some of the work of David Trelevin and talking about the importance of co-regulation, right? And that we as teachers actually need to train ourselves to widen our window of tolerance so it becomes more porous so we can actually co-regulate with students. So we are grounded enough that we create that sense of safety for students to do their best work.
Yeah, I would just say that we should actually say what grounded means, because it's a word that we all, including me, we throw around like, and I'm not sure, as a voice teacher, what do you think of when you think of grounded?
I think so for me, that means, you know, it's not a secret. We've talked about the fact that I tend toward hyperarousal as well. And so for me, it means that I call it my lava flow is low. Like I'm not in a place of rumination. I'm really present with the student. I am in a growth mindset. I'm very curious and open to what they're bringing into their room. I think that's kind of what comes to me when I'm thinking about grounded.
That's a really good explanation, and really good. And in short, when we are engaged, we can feel and think at the same time. That's really important. So I will, if you come into my room, if I'm enough in my right brain is the part that really can connect, that can be creative, that has affect, imagination. If I'm there, and I'm also, of course, aware of what's going on, there's a lot of messages going from the right brain to the left brain, and they really connect. But to reach this place of regulation within ourselves, it's not a place where we think, okay, it's not a thinking place.
Yes.
It's a really settling into ourselves place. And then finding, I mean, goodness knows, that's not always easy to do. So what we can do to help ourselves find enough regulations so that the person walking in can pick that up.
Just wondering, what are some ways that you find that groundedness or find your window of tolerance so you can remain present for what students bring into the room?
Well, I think the most important thing that comes to mind is for me to be able to recognize when I'm not regulated. That's a thing. Because in order to notice it, we have to have stepped out of our states enough to say, oh, be curious about what's going on. So, for instance, yesterday, and it's been a really, really busy, very fulfilling, very good, but extremely busy number of weeks. And I was just feeling anxious, and I couldn't figure out why I was anxious. First, I was thinking about it, like, okay, what has happened? No, that was not enough. So I took my own advice that I give to other people. Yay. I sat down. First, I just did a quick body scan. Are my feet there? My legs, feet were kind of there. So I just squeezed my toes, lengthen them in my shoes that gets things going in the legs. I breathed into my pelvic ball. I felt where, I'm doing this now as we speak, I felt where my body was accepting the support of the chair and the floor. Because when the nervous system picks up that there's support, it it has a tendency more to go towards safety rather than non-safety. So that's really important. So I found all of that. Another thing that helps the nervous system is to just let your eyes just look around the room that you're in. This really helps the vagus nerve, and just find what looks interesting to them and just stop. So this is being curious in a bottom up way from the body to the head. And then I started to pay attention to where I was feeling the anxiety. So I put my hand around my heart, and I put one hand below my belly button. And I just this is, first of all, a way to get flow happening in the body. When we have our hands in two different places, but with two different but related places, it helps energy to flow between those places. So the hands can be in any place, but I chose these two places. And I was able to settle myself and also find what it was that was bothering me. And so then I felt like I was ready to actually, first of all, go on with my day and really show up for the people who were depending on me to be present in there. And if I start to lose it, because sometimes, as we know, people can really push our buttons and we go the nervous system wants to pull us someplace else. And on days like this, especially, I'm very aware of that. And if that starts to happen, I just might put a hand here on the outside of my arm, here and here. The outside of my arm is like this. This sends a message of containment to the nervous system. And it really helps to just let everything just, again, settle in. So that's one of the things that I do. And then I was able to think and feel at the same time. So I knew that I was regulated. I wasn't being pulled into the anxiety.
Yeah. And I just want to underscore that these things that you're talking about, I mean, do not take a tremendous amount of time, right?
No.
And I think that's so important that we can actually, as teachers, do this for ourselves as a means of self-care, especially if we are feeling dysregulated. In between students, we can take that moment to find that connection within ourselves so we can connect outward.
Oh, yeah. And the more we do something, the more the brain recognizes it. I mean, that's really neuroplasticity. So yes, all that I just said happened probably in 3 minutes or something, but obviously I've been doing it a lot. But the more it's practiced, the more the brain recognizes. One of the things that's very helpful to do when we're feeling dysregulated a bit is to bring in a person or an animal or a favorite fictional character and just keep that in front of our mind and notice what the body tells us about why this is a good place to settle into. And it really works. And then if we do it with some frequency, then as soon as we bring that person to mind, the brain goes, oh yeah, everything starts to go down. It's quite something. It's just the way we learn new traits. That's what that is. So yeah.
Can you talk about one adjustment that you do for someone who tends toward hyperarousal, and maybe one adjustment that you give someone who tends to go toward hypo? Because I think that's kind of been the bulk of our research. Not only saying these are the somatic and vocal cues of hyper and hypo, but this is how we help people regulate.
The first thing that comes to mind is that I might ask that person who's in hyper arousal, after I've done, find the chair, all that stuff, I might ask them to close their eyes and bring to mind kind eyes. So it can be the eyes of a pet, a person. If they can't find that, the Dalai Lama, whose eyes, it looks like you can literally fall into them. Find those kind eyes. And even as I'm saying this, I can feel like things just, and then, so they find them. And then I ask them to see if they can take in the kindness, the concern, the compassion, if they can actually take that into their eyes. If they can, then can they send it back? So then that starts this energy between the student and the outside world. That really, because of the vagus nerve, it really helps that a lot. And most often, just after doing this little thing, when they open their eyes, they are in more of a ventral vagal or social engagement state. So their eyes are actually literally more open because it affects the eyelids. So they're literally more open. And most strikingly, they say, oh, things look brighter in the room. Oh, I could, because where we are in our physiological state affects the vision. So that has sent messages to their body of softening. So it goes from here to here. And doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is a big deal. And then the hypo person, to get out of hypoarousal or shutdown, we need one of two things especially. One is sympathetic activation. That's the way we get out of that. So I might ask them to push against a wall, to do push-ups, to run in place, to do jumping, something to get things going. And that really helps. Can be scary for them, but it helps. And also the other thing that helps get us out of that place is co-regulation.
Yeah.
So I might just talk to them. I often do this. Tell me about the last time, what you did recently that was really fun. That puts them in another part of their brain, literally, and this narrow focus just opens up. And then their face may light up and they become more activated in their bodies by just asking them those kind of questions that bring activation to their nervous system. Cool, right?
It's super cool. And
super cool.
And again, we'll write this down in an article or continue to preach this. But this idea of there are vocal adjustments, and we've also learned that there are adjustments of intention that also bring students back into that place of regulation where they become unlocked. They just become more of an open vessel and allow the sound. It not only changes the sound, but they just really become singing artists. They connect to themselves in such a deep and kind of powerful way.
That's such a good point, that they become singing artists instead of just singers.
Yeah.
Because they're connected. So their unique them can actually come out and not be hidden.
Well, again, thank you so much for your time. It's so great to have you on the podcast.
Oh, it's so nice to talk to you, David. Thank you.
This past spring, I had a lovely undergraduate soprano who was preparing for juries. Because she had worked with both Marcia and myself, she was able to recognize when she was becoming dysregulated and knew how to find her steadiness. In a previous jury, her nerves got the better of her, but not this time. She showed up, confident, vocally expressive, and at peace in her body. And her singing was glorious. It was so beautiful to see and hear. How are these frameworks of the window of tolerance and polyvagal theory resonating with you? Have certain students kind of come to mind as we've been talking about the somatic and vocal cues of hyper and hypoarousal? Sound off. You can email me at wholeheartedvoicepedagogy@gmail.com or find me on the socials. My handles on most platforms are Sisco Songs and at Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. I would love to hear from you. And as always, I'm going to ask you to subscribe to this podcast on whatever corner of the interweb you found me. I'll be releasing new episodes every 2 weeks, and I can't wait to share with you some of the great knowledge our guests are laying out for us. Just so exciting. More soon. Take care of you.